climate denial and to obstruct climate action. This political weapon has been wielded to create the illusion that climate must be a partisan issue. But more than 3 decades ago, committees of the U.S. Senate held bipartisan hearings on climate change. Members of both parties were alarmed at warnings from America's leading scientists about what combustion of fossil fuels was going to do to our climate. When I first arrived in the Senate in 2007, in the next few years, I recall 5 different bipartisan climate bills under consideration. The fossil fuel industry has fought hard to block any government action to limit carbon pollution, this despite the fact that much of the science, as we will hear, came from the industry's own scientists. The trick was to distance the industry from this climate denial effort, and the solution was dark money, freed up in the billions of dollars by 5 Republican justices in their 2010 Citizens United decision, after a barrage of amicus briefs from fossil fuel front groups. The masquerade obscuring the industry's hands was performed through fossil fuel-funded front groups and trade associations. Some leftover apparatus from the tobacco industry's fraudulent denial scheme was repurposed. Groups with benign-sounding names like Americans for Prosperity or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce were created or co-opted to spread deliberate disinformation and oppose climate action. This network, with its intricate links between dozens of groups, was the fossil fuel industry's web of denial. Collectively, the fossil fuel industry used this apparatus to spend billions of dollars on phony science, propaganda, political lobbying, and elections. Much of it was used to impose climate denial orthodoxy on the Republican Party. Ask former Congressman Bob Inglis. And why not spend a few $billion? The International Monetary Fund estimated that fossil fuel received a $650 billion subsidy in the United States in 2015 alone. So buying or renting the Republican Party or seizing it in a hostile takeover, whatever, was a total bargain. We have a window into this whole sordid mess thanks to the enterprising research of a determined group of academics, investigators, and journalists, some of whom are here today as witnesses. And we thank you for that work and for your presence. Of course, there's far more that we don't know. The front groups and trade associations obviously won't disclose their donors. The fossil fuel companies obviously don't want to disclose their donations. Some donors are so determined to keep their identity secret that they launder their donations through anonymizer groups such as Donors Trust. Shell corporations can be used to obscure true identities. One simple question to start with: who funded this phony climate science denial textbook that the Heartland Institute published and mailed to thousands of school teachers around the country? It purports, by the way, to be from something called the NIPCC, and to be a second edition. We know it cost a lot of money to print that. We don't know who paid for it. What instructions did fossil fuel companies give to front groups about opposing laws and regulations? And did that break the laws for nonprofit tax-exempt status? We don't know. How exactly did the fossil fuel industry deploy its front groups and trade associations to purposefully spread disinformation about climate science? We don't know. One of the top climate obstructors in America is the so-called U.S. Chamber of Commerce. How much money did the chamber receive from fossil fuel interests to provide these obstruction services? What was the deal? And what standard of due diligence did the chamber's actual board members meet about knowing what was going on? We could find out all these things and more. None of this information is privileged. All of it is amenable to congressional subpoena. Congress has a legitimate oversight interest in investigating whether fossil fuel companies are abusing 501c3 nonprofits to directly advance their own financial interests, or whether the fossil fuel industry has defrauded the public and policymakers about climate change, just as the tobacco industry did about cigarettes. Representative Henry Waxman's investigation of the tobacco industry was a fine example of Congress using its oversight powers for the public good. Of course, the fossil fuel industry's dark money control of the Republican Party makes Senate subpoenas unlikely now, but the time is nevertheless ripe for Congress to conduct thoroughgoing investigation into the fossil fuel industry and its dark money political operations. Republican senators are calling right now for the House minority to have subpoena power. If they'd give the Senate minority subpoena power, we'd certainly find good use for it. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I want to express my appreciation to all the senators who've attended, and particularly to the chairman of this committee, who has shown incredible leadership through hearing after hearing, Senator Schatz of Hawaii. Thank you, Brian. And with that, Justin Farrell of Wyoming.
Chairman Schatz, members of the committee, it's an honor to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Justin Farrell, and I'm a sociology professor at Yale University, where I research, write, and teach in our School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. My research uses rigorous scientific methods to examine corporate and political influences on climate change. I also study how these dynamics affect rural communities, especially in my native state of Wyoming and across the West. I was invited to speak with you today about the growing and now very well-established body of research on climate change disinformation and denial in the United States. Step back 30 years ago, Republican George H.W. Bush expressed confidently, quote, "We will talk about global warming and we will act." Public opinion reflected these concerns for Republicans and Democrats alike. Yet in a short time, we witnessed the utter collapse of bipartisan agreement and appetite for action. But why and how had this critical planetary issue become so politicized? So this striking puzzle caught the eye of some social scientists and historians, especially ones who study the influence of what we now call dark money. In recent years, this line of research has grown in scale and sophistication. As such, there's a diverse body of research from sociology, history, law, political science that provides strong empirical evidence of a well-funded and well-coordinated movement over 30 years' time intended to deceive the American people and thwart the political process. By any reliable measure, this political movement has been, and still is, immensely successful, sowing seeds of widespread popular doubt, transforming climate change into a sharply politicized issue, infusing climate denial into the highest levels of government, and obstructing policy solutions that are sorely needed to decarbonize our economy and mitigate the impacts of warming. And these are not simply my opinions, political or otherwise. They are based on data and facts, and not just by me, but by many, many expert researchers. Our work is subject to rigorous historical and scientific standards. Our work has been scrutinized through the peer review process and published in the best scientific journals in the world. A wide range of scholars, often from public universities in red and purple states, have been at the forefront of this research, including institutions such as Oklahoma State, Michigan State, Ohio State, George Mason University, the University of Colorado, Penn State University, just to name a few. I want to briefly highlight a few main findings from this field of research. First, research shows that fossil fuel funding launched a multi-pronged manipulation effort. Tens of millions of dollars, that's conservative, likely much, much more, were given to think tanks and other organizations willing to align themselves with the fossil fuel strategy of promoting false and misleading information. Research also shows that funding was allocated to create fake grassroots organizations, or front groups as we call them, staffed with fake experts, again with the intent of promoting doubt about CO2 and increasing global temperatures. Further, fossil fuel corporations and trade associations hired some of the best PR firms to test, tailor, and target messaging they knew would be effective in manipulating public opinion related to climate change. As experts in rhetorical manipulation, these public relations firms are a major actor in the broader public deception campaign. This huge effort was effective, and again is still effective, because money facilitated coordination between nearly 200 organizations, including many corporations, advocacy groups, media outlets, PR firms, trade associations, and philanthropic foundations. These financed efforts created the appearance of scientific credibility. So when the average American citizen turned on their cable news, or they listened to their talk radio, or they read their morning newspaper, they could not tell the difference between fossil fuel propaganda and trusted science. Second, research shows that fossil fuel funding aimed to concentrate power among a handful of well-coordinated organizations. Not all of the organizations in this denial effort are as successful as others. Levels of influence are often predicted by ties to the most powerful fossil fuel actors, especially ExxonMobil and the Koch network. Third, and in conclusion, while researchers have learned a great deal about these dynamics, we are severely limited by untraceable funding and inaccessible information. Specifically, the rise of untraceable donor-directed philanthropy, such as Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund, has made it very difficult for researchers to continue their work. One can certainly infer about these things, yet conjecture is not what we do as scholars. Data is our lifeblood, and yet private philanthropic and industry funding continues to be kept in the dark. Not only will better transparency improve our research, but it may also help to thwart large-scale manipulation campaigns before they begin or after they've already taken root. Thank you.
Professor Oreskes.
How do I turn this on?
You did.
I turned it. There we go. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm Naomi Oreskes. I teach the history of science at Harvard University. My testimony is based on 15 years of research in the history of climate science and on the history of attempts to undermine, distract attention from, and confuse the American people about that science. For more than 30 years, the fossil fuel industry and its allies have systematically misled the American people and contributed to inaction by discounting and disparaging climate science, misrepresenting scientific findings, and attempting to discredit climate scientists. These activities are documented in my recent co-author report, How Americans Were Deliberately Misled About Climate Change, as well as my 2010 book, Merchants of Doubt. A key aspect of fossil fuel disinformation has been the role of so-called third-party allies. These include think tanks such as the Cato Institute, astroturf organizations such as the Greening Earth Society, and trade associations such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. For decades, these organizations have reinforced fossil fuel industry messaging, such as the claim that the science is unsettled, that if climate change is occurring, we don't know what's causing it, or that it would be too expensive to fix. The role of third-party allies was on full display last week in hearings of the House Committee on Oversight, where Republican members invited as a witness the founder and president of Energy 45. Energy 45 is part of a group known as the CO2 Coalition. They illustrate a strategy I call zombie denialism, in which old players and arguments reappear in new forms. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, a leader in climate change disinformation was the George C. Marshall Institute. The institute closed in 2015, only to reemerge a few years later as the CO2 Coalition. Their representatives shamelessly repeated fossil fuel industry talking points, many of them deeply misleading, if not patently false. These included the claim that climate change will be, quote, mild and manageable. There is no scientific basis for this claim, and recent events in Texas, Puerto Rico, and California have shown that climate change is already becoming unmanageable. The claim that fossil fuels are cheap. Fossil fuels are not cheap. The International Monetary Fund estimates the external cost of fossil fuels at over $5 trillion each year. They make misleading assertions about the allegedly high cost of renewable energy. According to Bloomberg News, in two-thirds of the world, solar is now the cheapest form of newly installed electrical generation. The claim that under President Trump in the United States, under President Trump has cut greenhouse gas emissions. This is brazenly false. In fact, U.S. greenhouse emissions spiked in 2018, a 3% increase over the previous year. And most egregiously, a misleading narrative about fossil fuels solving energy poverty. As Pope Francis, Mary Robinson, Ban Ki-moon, and many others have emphasized, climate change hurts the poor above all. The cynicism behind this argument is simply astonishing. Many of the organizations that promote these false and misleading claims are incorporated as nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3s, and many claim to be involved in education. But they are supporting a for-profit activity, the oil and gas industry, and they have done many things to support a partisan political agenda. By its own admission, Energy 45 exists to support, quote, the Trump energy agenda. And as an educator, I can say with confidence that the activities of these organizations are not educational. In 27, the Heartland Institute sent a contrarian booklet, the one that Senator Whitehouse just showed us, to actually not thousands of teachers, hundreds of thousands of teachers, 200,000 teachers across America. The director of the National Center for Science Education has said of this booklet, quote, "It's clearly intended to confuse teachers." The National Science Teachers Association has called it propaganda. ExxonMobil is just one part of a large disinformation landscape. Because of loopholes in our laws, particularly those that permit dark money contributions, we lack basic information about who is behind much of this. Who coordinates these talking points? Who comes up with these misleading claims? And why, for example, is the National Black Chamber of Commerce opposing solar power in Florida? The tobacco industry was prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice under the RICO statutes, in part because of the ways in which individual companies coordinated with each other and with third-party allies to present false information to consumers. I believe that it's time for Congress to investigate the fossil fuel network, as Congress and the Department of Justice investigated the tobacco network. I believe the American people have the right to know who has been sustaining this massive effort to mislead us about climate change, an issue that threatens our basic constitutional rights to life, to liberty, and to property. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Tanner from Influence Map.
Good afternoon, members of the Special Committee on the Climate Crisis. I'm Dylan Tanner, Executive Director of Influence Map, a London-based think tank. We operate a platform for tracking climate lobbying globally. Our work is used by over 300 major investors with $35 trillion in assets, including the pension funds, New York State Common, and CalPERS. And our work has been cited in over 1,000 articles in the mainstream media over the last 4 years. The next slide, please. Here's an overview of what our analysis shows is an integrated strategy for control of the climate policy agenda by the fossil fuel value chain. This applies globally with the tactics varying by region. We see a range of activities from PR, narrative capture, regulatory lobbying, and the influencing of elections. Influence Map's work focuses on the activities we can attribute directly to companies and their trade groups. We do, however, realize that a big part of this picture relates to so-called dark money funding, where linkage to corporations is difficult. To put a number on the spending we do know about, we calculated that the 5 largest oil majors collectively spent $1 billion since the Paris Agreement on influencing activities. To put this number in context, their annual capex for oil and gas stands at $100 billion a year. And to requote the senator's statistic, the IMF states the U.S. alone provides $650 billion in fossil fuel subsidies each year. So apparently a great return on investment of lobbying dollars for these companies. Next slide, please. I want to focus now on the key role played by industry associations in this picture. Their primary focus is to control the regulatory agenda, although we are aware the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and its affiliates in particular are powerfully involved in U.S. direct election influencing. These groups are well-resourced, and importantly, they come to the table claiming to represent jobs and growth. So they're highly effective. We released a report in September of this year which concludes that many of the most influential and oppositional groups globally are in fact from the United States. You can see the main ones listed on the left-hand side. And we highlighted the hugely negative impact they've had in the last 3 years on a range of U.S. climate policy strands, including the Clean Power Plan, methane, and vehicle standards rollback. Next slide. I want to highlight 2 important trends here. The first is that companies are now outsourcing the most negative lobbying to these industry associations as it becomes politically unviable for them to be directly oppositional to climate policy themselves. This is exampled by recent dynamics between the American Petroleum Institute and its members on the U.S. methane rollback. The API has successfully lobbied for these rollbacks since 2016, while key board members Exxon, BP, and Shell have since distanced themselves from this lobbying effort. These companies have done this firstly by promoting their own voluntary methane reductions and then saying how they disagree with the latest rollback. Yet they have not stopped their lobbyists, the API, from pursuing these positions they now supposedly disagree with. The second trend concerns the very powerful cross-sector groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, or NAM. On climate change, these groups tend to adopt the lowest common denominator positions of their most oppositional members, often coal mining and fossil fuel-related companies. And the majority of the other members largely stay silent, so these oppositional views prevail. Next slide. Now, the Chamber keeps a scorecard for members of Congress on their voting behavior. We also keep a scorecard on the Chamber for its climate positions. And this is how it stacks up next to some of its key members. A clear disparity exists between the Chamber and some of the largest corporate members on climate change. Most of these corporations on the right-hand side of this chart are now loudly publicizing their own climate goals and commitments. A similar dynamic of misalignment exists within NAM.
May I interrupt and ask you what the leftmost one is, the M?
Marathon Petroleum.
Marathon Petroleum, what do you know? Thank you.
We do think pressure on these glaring contradictions will grow, not least from the pension funds and investors we're working with on this. These investors are long-term shareholders in corporate America, and they want to see this lobbying blockage removed and urgent policy action taken. Next slide. I want to end with a clip showing some of the U.S. Chamber's recent advertising on climate legislation in the United States. Thank you.
Climate legislation being considered by Congress could make it too expensive to heat our homes, power our lives, and drive our cars. Is this really how Americans want to live? Washington politicians should not demand what technology cannot deliver. Urge your senator to vote no on the Lieberman-Warner climate bill.
That's the new Clean Power Plant rule. It establishes a unique target for a reduced carbon emissions rate for each state. Okay, what's the cost? The rule could cost consumers and businesses $41 billion or more. That's per year. What can you do about the rising costs? Tell Congress to pass the Regulatory Accountability Act, requiring federal agencies like the EPA to consider alternatives that achieve the same objective at a lower cost.
They are so cute.
I can't believe how much energy they have.
Shh, don't say that.
What? Energy?
Yes. Have you seen how Katie McGinty tries to tax energy? Proposed $72 billion in BTU taxes under Clinton, as much as $1.8 billion in taxes on Pennsylvania energy. She even supported cap and trade.
If Katie McGinty sees how much energy they have, it's only a matter of time before she taxes it. Oh no, she heard you. Run, Jimmy, run!
The U.S. Chamber is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Classy. Thank you, Dawn. Mr. Rosenberg. I think you need to. Is your microphone on?
It's hard to see the light. It's hard to tell if it's on or not.
Thank you. Mr. Schatz, members of the committee, I'm very happy you have asked me to be here to explain the extent and limitations of congressional oversight authorities that are pertinent to these issues that my panelists have outlined. I spent 35 years with the Congressional Research Service with respect to, investigative oversight, and have, in the 11 or 12 years since I've retired, continued that interest in investigative oversight. I think I was known by some as a zealot for institutional prerogatives in this respect. In 2017, I published a book called When Congress Comes Calling, which anticipates, most of what I said, and also what Senator Whitehouse has already summarized. Very briefly, I'll take the next couple of minutes to flesh it out a little bit. In brief summary, Congress's power to engage in oversight and to conduct investigations reaching all sources of information necessary to carry out its legislative responsibilities is broad and encompassing. Congress and its committees have virtually plenary power to compel information production, needed to discharge their constitutional tasks. This applies whether the information is sought from executive agencies, private persons, or organizations. These information-gathering prerogatives are founded on 2 centuries of Supreme Court and appellate court precedents, as well as congressional practices over that period, that date back to the founding days of the Republic. My professional view is that the greatest restraint on congressional investigative oversight is the lack of will to enlist available and viable institutional safeguards it has at times when it is necessary to exercise them. And this is such a time. The Supreme Court case law is very clear. The power of inquiry is, quote, an essential and appropriate auxiliary of the legislative function, unquote. If a committee has been delegated jurisdiction by its House over a particular area of legislative concern and has been authorized to take compulsory actions, that is, issue subpoenas, to obtain necessary information on a subject on which legislation could be enacted, and that information sought would, again quoting, materially aid the decision whether or not to pass such legislation, that would be sufficient to support subpoena enforcement. Indeed, the court has held that it must be presumed that legislation was the object of that compulsory process. The court has also made it clear that if these precepts of enforcement validity are met, the fact that factual revelations might lead to criminal prosecutions will not vitiate Congress's information-gathering authority. In line with this recognition, broad compulsory power, the High Court and appellate courts have held that such properly based inquiries can overcome even First Amendment rights, and have deemed congressional investigative proceedings the legislative equivalent of a grand jury, which has translated into a judicially recognized limitation of witnesses' rights at investigative hearings. Witnesses' rights at such hearings are given at the sufferance of committees and include the discretionary right to preclude common law privilege on a case-by-case basis and to deny agencies and private parties to withhold access to proprietary, trade secret, privacy, and other sensitive information in their possession unless a statute expressly denies such congressional access. Recent appellate case law has held that even the president's executive communications privilege is a qualified one that can be overcome by a showing of necessity and unavailability of the matters at hand. Finally, each House has an unassailable authority to establish rules for the conduct of their internal proceedings and for the protection of their institutional prerogatives. In short, a committee having established its prescribed area of legislative jurisdiction, its authority to issue subpoenas, the pertinency of the matter under inquiry, together with its presumed legislative purpose, has an encompassing range of investigative authority. What's been happening, over in the House at least, is an executive attack on your subpoena enforcement authority, in which would, if the Senate issued subpoenas of such a nature, they would receive the same, answers. I've done a study which is about to be published, and I've given the staff a copy of the draft of the publication, in which I've covered 200 years of executive practice, legal opinions, and I present the conclusion that Congress has inalienable, indispensable rights of self-protection, institutional self-protection that allow them to get the information that they need through the subpoena power, and that by using historical proceedings of inherent contempt, which used to be trials on the floor of the House, and criminal contempt, directly appointed by the House or the Senate, bypassing the Department of Justice, which has an obvious conflict of interest in some of these kinds of cases.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rosenberg.
Does that. Thank you.
Chairman Schatz and I are going to be here through the hearing, so we will waive our questioning to allow colleagues to proceed. And the order at present is Senator Merkley, Senator Cortez Masto, Senator Udall, and Senator Heinrich, of those who are present.
As you're all speaking, I was thinking about a group of my wife's friends from high school who, when she was meeting with them a year or so ago, said, "Hey, can you get Jeff on the phone? We want to ask him a few questions." And it amounted to this. After we talked about a series of issues on which they tended to have a different opinion than I had, and I explained why, they said, "Well, here's the problem. How are we to know whom to believe? We're assaulted by messages from every side. We're trying to live our lives with our families. How are we to know what to believe?" And I think this disinformation campaign is so effective because that's a question many Americans are left with, bombarded by messages from various sources, very difficult to sort out exactly which ones are authentic and which ones are deliberately misleading. There is one strategy that none of you spoke to that I'd like you to comment on if you would like, and that is the strategy of dominating the courts. And how has the fossil fuel world gone about seeking to have favorable judges, rebuilding the makeup of the American judiciary to influence the course of decisions? And I just think it's another aspect that, if you have any insights on it, I'd be interested in hearing them.
Well, let me.
Mr. Rosenberg.
You can. Congressional committees can assert their institutional authorities. And these institutional authorities are blessed by major Supreme Court decisions that allow, in fact, insist that Congress can't abandon them, and neither can the executive or judiciary override them, that they can get the kind of information they need to deal with the kind of situations that you're that you're talking about. It would require an overturning by the Supreme Court of what appear to be core constitutional powers of the House and the Senate with respect to investigatory that go back to 1821 and have continued up currently to a case called Morrison versus Olson, which gives has said that prosecutorial discretion is not a core presidential power, and therefore the president can't interfere with your work.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenberg. Because our time's so limited, I appreciate your perspective on that. It's a little bit different angle than I'm concerned about, but many of us feel, that the role of Citizens United is a result of a strategy laid out that concentrates power and creates the dark money all of you were speaking to. So there's a very close relationship with the control of the courts, and we've witnessed that through a couple of Supreme Court nominations and the debates that occurred there. So let me turn to a different aspect of this, which is several of you spoke to the trade associations, and the chart that we saw up proceeded to show that individual groups within those trade associations may be carrying one tune while they're supporting a trade association that does the negative attack ad strategies. What's our most effective way? We've talked quite a bit about this among the Senate, and Senator Whitehouse really keeps pointing this out too. How can we most effectively organize to create true corporate responsibility on the issue of climate rather than kind of a greenwashing campaign?
I mean, this is the heart of the lobbying problem, as you defined it. It's the problematic in the cross-sector trade groups where you have all sectors together and they take the lowest position of the fossil companies often. And we see this globally, not just in the United States. An initiative that's emerged in the last few years has been the shareholders of both sets of companies demanding reform and governance of their trade groups and realization that these groups are tactically blocking, not denying climate, they're tactically delaying and blocking the much needed regulations. And we've seen an absolute acceleration of this under the current deregulatory administration, but it's not limited. It was happening before then. So the solution lies in the companies who are the members of these cross-sector trade groups essentially walking the talk on policy advocacy within those groups, and there is pressure from shareholder forces to get them to do this. It's not happening quick enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? So thank you for this conversation. I think we all obviously have concerns similar to what we have heard today and are trying to address how do we get the truth out there and how do we make an impact. So let me ask you a couple of questions. One, from what we heard today and what we already know based on the true facts that the fossil fuel industry has been engaged in this process for a number of years, one, how far have they set us back? And how much of their work to mislead the public and elected officials is to blame for our lack of progress in addressing climate change? So I'd love a conversation on that. But then also, I think in recent years, there's been more of this discussion, and the American public are now coming around to understanding and wanting and demanding us to address, and they believe climate change is happening. So can you talk about the dynamics between those two? I'm curious your thoughts on as you've looked at this issue, and I'll just open it to the panel. And Dr.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think we've been set back enormously. As several people have noted, President George H.W. Bush signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. So we already had enough scientific information in the early 1990s to tell us that dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system was underway. And President Bush promised to take concrete action to protect the climate. But that didn't happen. And if you look at the timing of when these organizations really started getting going in a big way, it's right around that same time. So as long as scientists were just doing science and publishing it in peer-reviewed journals, the fossil fuel industry wasn't really too worried. But when political action began to be taken, that's when we see the denial campaign kick in. So I think it's fair to say that we've lost nearly 30 years on this issue. And then the other big piece of it is that we know from their own industry strategy documents that the whole point of disinformation was to confuse the American people and undermine support for action. And we have a great deal of documentary evidence on this. So as we just heard from Senator Merkley, if people are confused, they don't know what to think, they don't know what the truth is, then they're unlikely to be mobilized to demand policy action. And that is exactly the point of this.
Okay, please.
I'll just add and echo that point, but also, I mean, public opinion in the early and mid-'90s, there were some polls that had Republicans just like 1 percentage point more likely to believe that it was a problem within the standard of error, but still. And so then you saw that completely collapse, as we've been talking about. And so I would say, yeah, just shy of 30 years progress. The other thing I would add, too, is the erosion of scientific credibility. The attack on science has had impacts that are far greater in some ways too. So,
thank you.
I would just add a comment. This problem is not something just happened 30 years ago. It's happening today. The narrative is switched to appearing to be rosy and part of the solution, and market-driven mechanisms. We're getting there, while delaying the inevitable regulations. So apparently agreeing with stuff, but then disagreeing with the fine print and blocking it. That's the current, in our view, state of the battleground.
No, and I appreciate you saying that because I know a September Washington Post climate poll found that nearly 8 in 10 Americans agree that human activity is fueling climate change, and roughly half believe action is urgently needed within the next decade to avert its worst effects. So the American public is there with us. And so this idea that somehow the fossil fuel industry is still promoting and pushing out misinformation, I think is disturbing to all of us. And the question is, what more can we do? I know I don't have enough time left, but I would love your thoughts on what else should we be doing other than what we are doing right now?
Right. Well, one thing we know from our work is that when you expose the disinformation, when you make people aware that this is disinformation, that's a game changer. And we refer to this as inoculation. And that gets back to the question that Senator Merkley asked about, what should we believe? Well, if you explain to people that this is disinformation, and in particular, if you show that they have used the same strategies and tactics as the tobacco industry, that's a powerful message because we all know now that the tobacco industry was not acting in good faith, simply providing a product that we all love, but was actually manipulating the American people. When you can show that something similar has happened here, that changes how people view it.
Yeah, please.
And again, just to add, but even inoculation requires that we know who the bad actors are, right? And that's where we need better data, and that's where we need more transparency and access to information, as Senator Whitehouse was saying from the opening. So there's excitement around public inoculation theory, but again, I think it would really help if we knew who to inoculate against, right?
Right. And my time is up, but I do have to say one final thing. Thank you to the scientists. Thank you for the scientists across this country, including in the state of Nevada, who are coming forward, who are speaking up, who are organizing, who are out there talking truth. Really, to me, I've never seen that quite at that level. And so I think we all thank you to the scientists for being very, very vocal. So I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
The experience of the Waxman investigations over 20 years shows that what we're saying here is correct. You have to keep going forward, telling the story, revealing the kinds of things that are going on. But it takes a long time. I mean, Waxman was at it for over 20 years until finally there was, an effective law passed in 2009. So that it's a difficult task, but it can be done and the Congress can help it with effective oversight and presenting it over and over again to the public that there's something wrong here.
Thank you very much, and let me first of all just thank Chairman Schatz and Chairman Whitehouse for being involved in this. I want to echo what Senator Cortez Masto said. The scientists all over the world are just impressive how they've hung in there. And I think that consistent message is breaking through. And you can see that in the public opinion polls. And I'm reminded a little bit, one of you mentioned, I think, the tobacco industry. I was one of the state attorneys general that brought a tobacco lawsuit with other attorneys general. And early on, people didn't believe us. But then when they saw the deceptive techniques and they saw all this behind-the-scenes dark money and doing it, it really backfired on them in a very dramatic way. And so I think there's real hope when we look at that. And many of us here, Senator Whitehouse and others, I think all of us at this table have worked to pass the For the People Act. I think you all are familiar with that, H.R. 1 out of the House. And one of its purposes is to get the dark money out of politics and go to a different system, reform our democracy, and obviously the result could be real climate change legislation. And one of our biggest obstacles is our broken campaign finance system. So my question is kind of a double-barreled one. Are we ever going to see major congressional action on climate change, or do we need federal reform of our campaign finance system before we can make any real progress? And it's a question to all the panelists here.
Well, you know,
You're smiling. I like that.
yeah. I work very closely with a lot of scientists. I'm on the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund and a number of other things. And I'm trained originally as a scientist myself. When I speak with scientists about this issue, often it comes down to scientists saying, we need campaign finance reform. And then I get a little depressed because I think, well, scientists don't know how to do that, right? So, of course, you're right. But I do think that, you know, we can't wait for that to happen. I think we have to be working on both ends. And while we work on the campaign finance reform, I also think we can pursue this idea of exposing the malfeasance. And I think, you know, I came to this issue because I wrote a book that was partly about the relationship between climate change denial and the tobacco industry, and showed that the people who were denying climate change were the same people, same organizations, same strategies and tactics, same PR groups, I mean, on and on and on. And so that led me to start, well, not me, I would give public lectures and people would ask me, well, how did we ever get tobacco control given the power of the tobacco industry? And this is the best thing about giving public talks, or you probably have this on the campaign trail. People ask really good questions that force you to think harder. And I remember thinking, that's a really good question. And so I started learning more about what Henry Waxman had done and the role that Congress had played in exposing the malfeasance. And by the way, thank you for your work as an Attorney General. The state Attorney General case was absolutely crucial. So I think those kinds of models about exposing the truth of what has happened can be very powerful.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I won't comment on the campaign reform, but an intermediate step on the legal is more legal formulation of SEC requirements for companies to disclose climate risk and their climate positions to investors and in a legal framework. It would be somewhat of a game changer in this silent majority that is problematic in some of these trade groups.
And I'll add, too, that, you know, maybe climate scientists wouldn't feel as comfortable contributing to campaign finance reform, but I think social scientists have a unique role to play in that we can, you know, show why we would need it, right? And that's essentially why I'm here today, is to show the body of research, the reputable facts that we have to really demonstrate the deception that's occurred and how the public has been sold a bill of goods.
Yeah. Thank you.
Senator Heiner.
Mr. Tanner, I want to return to that issue of risk, because while the inaction on climate that's been coordinated and facilitated by groups like ALEC and NAM and the U.S. Chamber is actually creating enormous financial risk in a number of business sectors. So if you look at the insurance industry, coastal real estate, any number of sectors that are you know, looking at numbers, seeing the change, and are very worried about the future, that's a very real financial risk. And I'm curious, why do you believe the other members of these trade groups who are seeing that risk on their balance sheets materialize, why are they still going along with this lowest common denominator approach to trade groups? And more importantly, how does that square with their responsibilities to their own investors?
I mean, I can't speak directly for companies. Anecdotally, a range of issues. We stay in these trade groups to change them internally without disclosing those activities. We don't agree with the positions, but they do other stuff for us, so we remain in. The legislation that the fossil fuel companies are blocking through these trade groups is perhaps they don't perceive it as presenting an immediate risk to themselves. So and I understand there's somewhat of a gentleman's agreement within these trade groups. You don't speak out on issues that are not directly affecting you. So a range of factors.
Ms. Oreskes, did you want to add?
Yeah, that gentleman's agreement thing is a big one. I remember years ago asking some people I knew in the nuclear power industry, why weren't they picking up climate change as an issue? And they said, well, we promised the coal people we wouldn't talk about climate change if they didn't talk about nuclear waste.
Yeah, that's working out real well for them, isn't it? Let's talk about denialism. Now it's become delayism. You know, we know that many of these energy industry actors have been aware of the science for a very long time. But what's changed is that there's now something called attribution science, which has changed how you can predict the relationship between what is going on in an individual event as opposed to something like the weather or climate, and the risk that all of this additional carbon pollution has added to that. Is that going to impact their potential legal liability as that becomes more and more accepted within the scientific community, and then that attribution science makes its way into the courts to look at what is the liability if you knew, you continue to do it, you continue to fight the solutions, and yet your primary action here was to not take action on any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a lawyer, so obviously I can't speak to the legal aspects, but I can speak to the scientific aspects. So this has been one of the big breakthroughs in climate science in the last 10 years, that we can now attribute with a high degree of certainty that specific weather events have been made worse by climate change. And so that means that we can begin to talk about the damages, and we're seeing that already being taken up by lawyers in California, for example. And I think there's a lot of, again, we mentioned state AGs before. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the states' attorney generals to begin to think about the concrete financial cost to the American people of climate change denial and disinformation.
I was interested to hear that the talk about shareholder pressure, because one of the things that I've seen change in the last few years in terms of corporate trends is much more employee pressure on their own employers. And I'm curious if any of you had looked at the pressure that employees at places like Amazon are now putting on their own corporations to take a more leadership role and maybe not accept the sort of gentleman's agreement that has put us at the precipice we're on today.
I can't give you any specific evidence of that, but I do know that that's a strategy being employed by a number of not-for-profit groups to as another lever to get these companies to move more quickly and with more urgency. And so I think that it is a very true phenomena that we'll see soon.
As an employee of Harvard, I can say that quite a few of us have been trying to get our university to divest from fossil fuels, led by Senator Tim Wirth, who some of you know. It's been hard. It's an uphill battle. You know, institutions are very conservative. They're afraid of change. And I think the more powerful the institution is, the more they are afraid of change.
Thank you all for being here. Professor Oreskes, I really appreciate the way you have crisply described this apparatus of climate denial, and but I think we're in a new phase. I think everyone sort of made reference to the idea that the new permission structure has been established for Republican leaders and corporate leaders to not deny the existence of climate change, but then propose either suboptimal policies or just outsource their nefarious activities to a trade association. And I'd like you to put a fine point on when you think that pivot has happened. Do you think it's explicit, or do you think it was sort of an organic reaction to how untenable their previous position was? What's going on? Because to the extent that we can begin the inoculation against the op-eds that say, look, I'm for climate action, but not that climate action, I think it's important to get it on the record now.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's hard to answer because, again, we don't have access, as Justin has been saying. We don't have access to the internal documents. I mean, I was able to write the book I wrote really because of the work of the state attorney generals that exposed the tobacco industry malfeasance. We had a huge, rich documentary record on that. We don't know as much about what's going on inside ExxonMobil or Chevron headquarters today. But I think that periodically we've seen a lot of different shifts. I guess I am a little reluctant to say that there has been a really big shift, because one of the things you see in the history of this story is that they're constantly shifting. They'll use a particular argument for a while until it gets impossible to say with a straight face. So, you know, back in the 90s, people said, well, yeah, maybe there's some climate change, but we don't know what's causing it. And there's like, well, we know it's what's causing it, but it's too expensive to fix. Well, maybe we could fix it, but it would wreck the economy. And then after they go through all those arguments, they come back to there's no climate change. And we've seen this happen again and again. So I wouldn't be too confident that we wouldn't come back to, and actually the Heartland book that you mentioned says that the science isn't settled, that we don't really know.
So that the burning ember of all of this is not any particular position, but what they don't want to do.
Exactly. And I think that's crucial because I think we make a mistake if we focus too much on a particular argument because they'll just shift.
Well,
and
so this is what I wanted to get to, and it's really important for us to understand this in the context not so much of the successful model, a la Henry Waxman and what we did with tobacco, but the so far unsuccessful model as it relates to gun safety. We've already won the battle for public opinion, and we've won it in such a decisive way that if we already have good numbers on climate, but on guns, it's just through the roof, Republicans, independents, and Democrats alike. And yet, here we are. And so I'd like you to talk, Professor Oreskes, not so much about the spin and the PR and the talking points that are provided, but the structural control of the Congress that leads members of Congress to, despite the fact that what they're doing is deeply unpopular almost everywhere, do it anyway. And I think that we make a mistake not just by chasing the PR ball all around the court, but to misunderstand their willingness to incur political risk on the kind of I had a bad day in the newspaper side, when their true fear is I had a bad day on the super PAC side, and that's what this is all about.
Well, right, and you, of course, know much more about that than I do. I'm a science historian, not a political historian, but clearly this is the case. I mean, we are seeing the ways in which members of Congress are essentially controlled by the fossil fuel industry. And again, how do you get people, I mean, people are voting for these members even though they don't agree with what they're doing, and that's a huge political problem. And I don't know, you're a sociologist, maybe you can explain it.
That too. I think part of it is there's this black box and we just see the outcomes. And that's with a lot of the work that we do, our data, it's very piecemeal, it's very limited. And so we're constantly kind of seeing the consequences and then tracing backward. And we don't really understand. And that's the only way we can kind of decode this, what's going on. And we can point to, these untraceable funding. But beyond that, it's very difficult. But you can't see the outcomes, obviously. But
Mr. Tanner, last question. 7 of 10 of the most powerful anti-climate action organizations are located in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking about 7 in 10 on the planet are located in this town. On some level, that makes sense, but on another level, it's not where all of the fossil fuel decisions are being made. What do you make of the fact that most of the denial apparatus is located here?
That's computed based on the importance of the U.S. economy in emissions and the strength of those groups and their quite diehard opposition to regulations. And that's a situation that exists in some other economies, but the importance of the U.S. economy means that we deem those to be the most negatively influential.
But have these international fossil fuel companies decided that as Washington, D.C. goes, so does the rest of the world, so that a more efficacious use of their dollars and their clout is in Washington, D.C., and that'll flow all the way through wherever they have
Perhaps.
assets?
I mean, there's similar apparatus in other regions using different tactics, possibly softer tactics. So it's different tactics for different regions, but with the same result in most cases. So Australia, Canada, it's the same players.
Thank you.
Let me start with an observation, which is that there's sort of a cascade that has happened, a cascade into darkness with the Citizens United decision that opened up unlimited special interest money and the immediate recourse of big special interests to a variety of devices to make sure that they were spending unlimited dark money and had hidden their hands. But the third level of the cascade is that even if you know about the unlimited money spending, and even if you can get information about the unlimited dark money spending and dig that information out, the hardest part is to try to figure out about the conversations that took place powered by the unlimited dark money capability that these special interests have. The hardest thing to find around here is the small room where the lobbyist and the candidate met, and the lobbyist said, "We are coming after you. You are toast if you don't do what we say." And the candidate realizing that with millions, billions of potential dark money spending to drop, that is a very real threat. So I just, warn everybody that we may be able to get better clarity about how the dark money is being spent, and that will scare some of the cockroaches away from the light. They'll scuttle back into the corners a little bit. But ultimately, the threats that Citizens United enabled are the darkest part of this, and they're going to be really hard to dig out. Mr. Tanner, you've identified the Chamber of Commerce, the so-called U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers as the two worst climate obstructors in America. Could you give us a few words on how it is that those organizations earned that distinction in your analysis? By being awful.
It's the fact that they claim to represent the entirety of corporate America, and that's a very powerful mandate. NAM's record on taking advantage of the deregulatory dynamic under the current administration has been very, very effective. They both have very, very large budgets, and the Chamber of Commerce, in addition to engaging in a lobbying activity, also has a foundation which provides election interference. So we judge their influence and importance based on consensus that these are hugely influential groups in Washington, and we look at their positions and the results of those positions on the various strands of regulations, which has been quite dramatic over the last 3 years, quite dramatic.
And the way in which they have been weaponized with electioneering funding and dark money, does that make them different than, say, Business Roundtable or other corporate leadership groups in your calculation?
Specifically, the Chamber engages in election issues and influencing that maybe is not present in the group you just mentioned. So I would single that group out as perhaps the most negatively influential in the United States.
Professor Oreskes and Professor Farrell, what have your observations been? What does your research tell you about the role of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in this unpleasant saga?
Yeah, well, as I think you know, Senator Whitehouse, I've been doing research on the history of the National Organization of Manufacturers, and they have been opposing regulation in the United States for over 100 years. Going back to debates over child labor, they fought to prevent laws to prevent child labor in this country. So this tells you something about what kind of organization this is, but it also helps to answer the question of why other companies go along with it. Because there are many people in corporate America who have bought onto the argument that regulation is a bad thing and that it's appropriate for these trade organizations to be fighting regulation. And so even though they may not be particularly concerned about climate change one way or the other, they will support NAM's anti-regulatory activities. And there's a very, very long history of that.
And if they can hold their nose with respect to some of the unpleasant regulatory work that NAM or the Chamber do, there's always the prospect that one day they'll need them to be their
exactly. I think
advocate,
that's right.
their bully.
Yes.
Professor Farrell?
A few papers that I published in 2016, I was surprised in my data the centrality of the Chamber. I didn't expect that in terms of being bridge builders, gatekeepers within that network, the network of denial. And then I think it was like 160 organizations. They were quite central.
Last question. Roughly how many organizations participate in this web of denial that you have described for each of Professor Farrell?
It changes, but I would estimate between 164 to about 200, depending. I think Dr. Robert Brule has worked on that and is always finding more.
So they can always move a new chess piece out onto the
right,
board.
Or they may shut down. Maybe it's a front group that sprouted up They had some money, put out some flyers, put up a blog, website, all of that, and then they shut their doors. And so it does fluctuate.
Ms. Orski, is the scale of the operation, same question?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's actually astonishing how giant this is. And just to give one statistic, so back in the mid-2000s, the Royal Society of the United Kingdom researched this question because ExxonMobil was presenting a lot of information that flew in the face of the scientific evidence. And the Royal Society is one of the world's oldest scientific societies. So they researched this. And just in the year 2005 alone, just ExxonMobil funded 39 different organizations that presented misleading or inaccurate information about climate change. So that's just one node in this network. And that was 39 different organizations.
Mr. Tanner, anything to add about the scope of this operation?
Yeah, I will limit my comments to trade associations, and we cover about 100 of them globally, of which about 30, 40 are in the United States. The common theme there is almost all are negative on ambitious climate policy, and so that's not true of the corporate population as a whole. You see a much more active, positive contingent, but it speaks to this outsourcing of the negative stuff to the trade groups, and that dynamic has to change if we're going to get anywhere soon on climate.
Particularly if the trade associations are the ones that are weaponized.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, let me thank all of the witnesses. Your expertise and your persistence and your courage up against this web of denial has really been something. It helps us a lot. You give us levers, fulcrums to work our levers from, I should say. And Mr. Rosenberg, thank you for your passionate advocacy for a strong role for Congress to help the American people get to the bottom and get to what Paul Harvey called the end of the story.
Let me just add one thing about persistence. If your committee and other committees continue to be persistent, one thing that the Waxman exploit evidences and what's happening now with the impeachment pressures, it will be people who will open up for those doors and come in, whistleblower types that will come and say, yes, here's what I heard, here's what we did, here's the paper, here's the conversation.
If we persist.
If you persist. Good
word to end on. Thank you all very much. This has been a terrific hearing. Thank you, Chairman Schatz, for allowing this to be conducted.